The stop that changed everything. It was a calm afternoon on the endless stretch of Highway 163, just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. The desert sun burned low, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and crimson. Heat waves rippled off the asphalt, making the road ahead shimmer like a mirage. Deputy Ray Callahan had been with the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office for 22 years, long enough to know this road like the back of his hand. He leaned back in his patrol SUV, sipping a lukewarm coffee, eyes scanning the sparse traffic for anything that stood out. Callahan prided himself on being sharp, instinctive, and though never openly discussed, had built a reputation for pulling over certain kinds of drivers more often than others. Then he saw it. A sleek midnight blue Cadillac Escalade in the distance, gliding down the highway just a few miles over the speed limit. The tinted windows and custom rims practically screamed big money. Callahan smirked, rolling his shoulders as he reached for the siren switch. All right, let's see what we've got here. The red and blue lights flickered to life. The Escalade's brake lights flashed in response. He had no idea that the man behind the wheel was about to change everything for him, for the town, and for the future of justice. The Escalade slowed smoothly, pulling onto the sun-baked shoulder of the New Mexico highway. As Deputy Callahan stepped out of his cruiser, the scent of hot asphalt filled the air. The tinted driver's window rolled down with a quiet hum. Seated inside was a young black man, immaculately dressed in a charcoal gray suit, the kind tailored to perfection. He exuded an effortless confidence, not arrogance, not defiance, just certainty. Callahan approached, posture stiff, his presence deliberately imposing. "License and registration," he ordered, his voice edged with authority. The man complied without hesitation, handing over the documents with a polite nod. Callahan studied the license, Julian Carter. The name didn't ring a bell, but something about the polished demeanor unsettled him. The papers were flawless. Still, he wasn't satisfied. "You know why I pulled you over?" Callahan asked, a sliver of condescension lacing his words. Carter met his gaze evenly. "I assume you'll tell me." His voice was calm, unshaken. Callahan frowned. No stammering, no excuses, just measured self-assurance. That alone made him itch. "You were speeding," he said, though the claim felt flimsy, even to him. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Step out of the vehicle." For a moment, there was only the low hum of cicadas in the distance. Then, without protest, Carter pushed the door open and stepped onto the roadside. He was tall, well-built, carrying himself with a quiet control that only made Callahan more suspicious. "What brings you out here?" Callahan asked, circling the Escalade as if searching for a reason to escalate. "Work." Carter clasped his hands in front of him, unreadable. Callahan's fingers tapped against his holster. Something about the man's unshakable composure bothered him, and he wasn't sure why. "You're real calm for someone who just got pulled over. Got something to hide." Carter's lips barely curled into a smile, but his eyes never wavered. "No, officer, do you?" The words landed like a gut punch. Callahan's jaw tightened, his authority suddenly feeling flimsy. This wasn't going to be just another routine stop. It was about to change everything for him, for Carter, and for the future of justice. Callahan's irritation simmered as he circled the Cadillac Escalade, his boots crunching against the gravel. He peered through the tinted windows with exaggerated scrutiny, tapping the back of the SUV with his flashlight. It was still broad daylight, but the gesture wasn't about visibility, it was instinct, a silent way to mark his presence. Carter hesitated a mere second, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send the deputy's suspicion flaring. "Is there a problem with my documents?" Carter asked, his tone still calm, but now carrying a trace of curiosity. Callahan narrowed his eyes. "You seem awfully interested in my questions." Carter sighed but complied, pressing a button on his key fob. The trunk released with a soft click, revealing a neatly packed leather briefcase and a small duffel bag resting inside. Callahan yanked the duffel off the floor, unzipping it with deliberate roughness. He rifled through neatly folded shirts, a pair of polished dress shoes, and a few carefully packed personal items. Traveling for work, huh? Callahan mused, holding up a silk tie as if it were evidence. What kind of job needs a wardrobe like this? Carter leaned against the SUV, arms crossed, utterly unbothered. The kind where appearances matter. Should I be concerned about the way you're handling my things? Callahan stiffened. He pulled out a shaving kit, turning it over in his hands as though expecting to find something incriminating. Nothing. The sheer normalcy of it all only fueled his frustration. You're awful bold for someone pulled over on my highway, Callahan muttered. Carter tilted his head slightly. Your highway? He let the words hang in the air, his voice cool but edged with a challenge. Didn't realize Highway 163 was private property. Callahan stepped forward, now toe-to-toe with Carter, looming over him. You've got a smart mouth. That might not work out so well for you. Carter didn't flinch. If anything, his gaze sharpened. Deputy, he said, voice lower now, deliberate. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Callahan scoffed. Is that a threat? Carter shook his head. It's a question. Before Callahan could answer, the distant hum of tires broke the silence. A passing sedan slowed, its occupants clearly watching the interaction. In the back seat, two kids pressed their faces against the window, eyes wide, taking in the scene. For the first time, Callahan felt the weight of something bigger settling over him, something he couldn't quite shake. Callahan shifted, suddenly hyper-aware of how the situation looked. The passing car was gone, but the moment lingered. You can drop the theatrics, Carter said, his voice calm, but this time, there was an edge to it. I'm not who you think I am, and you're about to find that out. Callahan's lips parted, ready to fire back, but something in Carter's tone made him hesitate. There was no threat, no bravado, just certainty, and that certainty rattled him. Instead of answering, Callahan turned on his heel, stalking back to his patrol SUV. He slid into the driver's seat and punched Carter's information into the department database. The results loaded instantly. Callahan's breath hitched. Julian Carter, the newly elected governor of New Mexico. His stomach dropped. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, his mind struggling to catch up with reality. Then, slowly, his gaze lifted to the man standing outside, now casually leaning against the driver's door of the Escalade. Carter met Callahan's eyes through the windshield. He had been waiting. I take it you figured it out by now, Carter asked. Callahan's fingers clenched around the steering wheel. Everything had shifted. The authority he had wielded just moments ago now felt like a paper shield. He stepped out of the SUV, his boots hitting the ground with none of the confidence he had before. Governor Carter, he stammered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Carter pushed off the Escalade, closing the space between them. His face wasn't smug, wasn't angry. It was something worse. Calm. What now, Deputy Callahan? The question hit like a gut punch, because the power dynamic had just flipped hard. Callahan swallowed, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle on him like a lead blanket. He had assumed, he had judged, and now he had humiliated himself. But Carter, he didn't gloat, didn't press. He simply studied Callahan, measuring the moment. And then, after an unbearable silence, Carter spoke. Let's talk about what just happened. Callahan stiffened. I complied with everything you asked. Carter continued, his voice steady but piercing. My documents are in order. I broke no laws, and yet here we are. Tell me why. Callahan had nothing. No real excuse, no justification that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. His jaw clenched. He gripped his belt like it was the last thing tethering him to solid ground. I was just doing my job, he muttered, but even he didn't believe that anymore. Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression bordering on pity. Your job, is that what you call this? He gestured toward the open trunk, where his carefully packed belongings had been carelessly tossed aside. Tell me, Deputy Callahan, do you treat every driver like this? Or just the ones who look like me? Callahan's jaw tightened. His face burned with the weight of the question. He looked down, suddenly unable to meet Carter's gaze. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered, the admission bitter on his tongue. Carter let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Exactly." His tone hardened, the patience thinning. "You didn't know who I was. But you assumed I was someone you could treat like this, someone you could dismiss, humiliate, maybe even intimidate. And why?" He took a step closer, voice unwavering. "Because of how I look? Because of the car I drive? Tell me, Deputy, what was it?" Callahan's hands curled into fists, not in anger, but in shame. He started, but Carter cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it." His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Callahan. I'm here to teach you something. Whether you learn it or not, that's on you." Callahan's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Teach me." Carter nodded. "There's a community forum tonight, not far from here. You're coming with me. You're going to sit there and listen to the people you claim to serve. Maybe then you'll understand the impact of what just happened here. Maybe then you'll see the bigger picture." Callahan stared, thrown by the demand. "You want me to go to a forum?" His voice was stiff, defensive. "I don't want you to." Carter's expression hardened. "I'm telling you to, as your governor." The air between them thickened. Callahan hesitated, pride warring with reality. But deep down, he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he muttered. The word came out rough, but the usual sharpness in his tone was missing. Carter studied him for a beat longer before stepping even closer, his voice lower but sharper than ever. "This isn't about embarrassing you." He met Callahan's eyes head-on. "It's about making sure you never do this to anyone else, not because you're afraid of who they might be, but because you've learned to respect everyone equally." The words hit their mark. Callahan inhaled, steadying himself, then gave a small, reluctant nod. His face was unreadable, but inside, something was shifting. "Good." Carter turned, heading back toward his car. "Follow me. I'll make sure you're seated front and center." As they drove toward the forum, Callahan's hands stayed tight on the wheel, his mind racing. This night was about to change everything for better or worse. The two vehicles pulled into the gravel lot of a small community center on the outskirts of Santa Fe. A modest crowd had already gathered outside, their conversations blending into a low murmur of anticipation. Inside, rows of metal folding chairs faced a raised platform, where a lone microphone stood waiting to amplify voices that had long been ignored, dismissed, unheard. Callahan stepped out of his patrol SUV, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He cast a wary glance at Carter, who stood by his Escalade with the same calm, controlled presence he had carried throughout the evening. Carter met his gaze and tilted his head toward the entrance. "Move." Callahan followed, his stomach knotting tighter with every step. The room was full. Men, women, teenagers, even a few young children packed the seats, their faces a mix of weariness, hope, frustration, and resilience. As Callahan entered, heads turned. Some gazes were neutral, others were cold. His uniform felt heavier than ever, the badge on his chest no longer a symbol of authority, but a reminder of the divide between him and them. Carter led him to the front row, where a seat had been saved. Callahan sat stiffly, hands braced on his knees, as Carter approached the microphone. "Good evening, everyone." Carter's voice was steady, confident. "Thank you for being here. This forum exists because your voices matter. Too often, those in power forget that. Tonight, we're here to listen, to learn, and to grow. And that includes me and others who serve our community." He glanced toward Callahan, subtle but pointed. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Then, the first speaker stepped forward. She was a middle-aged woman, her tired eyes heavy with emotion. She clutched a folded photograph in her hands. When she spoke, her voice shook. "My son was pulled over last year." She took a breath. "He was 17, just got his license. The officer said his taillight was out, but we checked the next morning, it wasn't." Her voice cracked. "He called me from the car, whispering, afraid to even reach for his wallet." Callahan shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. More stories followed. A young man recounted being frisked outside his own apartment because he fit a description. An elderly man spoke of the fear that gripped him every time his grandsons left the house. A teenage girl described being stopped while jogging through her own neighborhood, asked where she lived as if her presence alone was suspicious. Each story chipped away at Callahan's defenses, peeling back layers of denial he hadn't realized he carried. Then, a boy no older than 10 approached the microphone. He was small, his hands gripping the stand tightly as he looked out at the crowd. "My dad tells me to always be polite to the police," he said, his voice high and clear. "But sometimes I think even if I'm polite, they won't like me anyway. Is that true?" The silence that followed was deafening. Callahan's chest tightened. He watched the boy step down, his words lingering in the air like a challenge no one wanted to face. And for the first time in his career, Callahan wondered if he had ever truly seen the people he was meant to protect. Carter stepped back up to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "This," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, "is why we're here, to face the hard truths, to own up to the damage that's been done, and to make sure the next generation doesn't grow up thinking respect is a one-way street." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Then, Carter turned toward Callahan. His expression was unreadable. "Deputy Callahan, would you like to say something?" Every eye in the room shifted toward him. Callahan felt frozen. His pulse thundered in his ears. But then slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his belt. He cleared his throat. His voice came out rough, uncertain, but real. He hesitated, then forced himself to meet their eyes. "I've spent years believing I was doing my job the right way, that I was enforcing the law the way it was meant to be enforced. But tonight," he took a breath, "tonight I realize I've been enforcing my own bias instead." Silence. Callahan swallowed, his throat dry. But he wasn't done. "For that, I'm sorry." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect trust overnight," he continued, his voice steadying. "But I promise you this: I'm going to do better. I'll start by listening, by learning, and by making sure my actions reflect the respect that every single one of you deserves." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then a single clap, and another, then more. The applause grew, not overwhelming, not deafening, but real. Callahan's throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something else, something like hope. As the forum ended and the crowd dispersed, Callahan stayed behind, rooted to his seat. The air in the room felt different now, like the last fading notes of a powerful symphony. He stared down at his hands, the weight of the night pressing on him. A presence loomed beside him, Carter. For a moment, he said nothing. Then quietly he spoke. "You did something tonight that most people never get the chance to do," Carter said. "You admitted you were wrong. That's the first step, but it's not the last." Callahan looked up, gratitude and exhaustion mixing in his expression. He knew Carter was right. The road ahead wasn't easy. But for the first time he was ready to walk it. Callahan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I don't even know where to begin." His voice was quieter now, sincere, stripped down. Carter didn't hesitate. "You start by showing up." Callahan looked up. "Not just here, but everywhere you're needed," Carter continued. "Show up to listen, to learn, to change. That's how you earn trust, not with words, but with actions." Callahan nodded. The simplicity of the words hit harder than any lecture ever could. He swallowed. "I want to be better." The words barely left his lips. Carter studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he offered the faintest smile. "Then be better." He clapped Callahan once on the shoulder. "It's as simple and as hard as that." As they stepped outside, the night air was cool against Callahan's skin. The weight that had been suffocating him all night felt a dot lighter. Carter stopped beside his Escalade, turning back one last time. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "people like you are the reason I ran for office. Not to punish, but to change things." He held Callahan's gaze. I believe people can learn, even you, Deputy Callahan." A soft, almost self-deprecating chuckle escaped Callahan's lips. "I guess I've got a lot of learning to do." Carter smiled. "We all do." He opened the door, but before getting in, he hesitated. "This isn't just about you," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "It's about the people you serve. Never forget that." Callahan nodded, this time with conviction. As Carter drove away, Callahan stood there, watching the taillights fade into the night. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man enforcing the law. He felt like a man learning to understand it. The next morning, Callahan returned to work with a notebook tucked into his pocket. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. Attending forums he would have ignored, having conversations he once avoided. The stories from the community center played on repeat in his mind, a reminder that his actions didn't just end with an arrest or a ticket. They rippled outward, touching lives. Months later, Carter received a letter in the mail. It was from Callahan. Inside the envelope, a handwritten note rested beside a photograph of a newly formed Community Safety and Police Relations Board. Callahan's words, raw and honest, spoke volumes. "I still have so much to learn, but I'm learning. Thank you for giving me the chance to see things differently." Governor Carter read the letter, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He set it gently on his desk and leaned back, his mind drifting to the young boy who had asked the hardest question of the night. "Is it true they won't like me anyway?" There was no easy answer, but for the first time in a long time, Carter felt something stir hope. Hope that one day, fear would no longer be mistaken for respect. That one day, respect would be given not out of obligation, but because it was simply right. The journey of Governor Carter and Deputy Callahan serves as a reminder: real change begins with truth and takes root through action. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect, listen, learn, and when the time comes, stand up. Subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and push us all toward a better world together.